I am Linnell Cadre, the Vice Provost for Equity and Inclusion. Thank you all so much for joining us for the fourth of our 5-series Inclusive Classrooms. Today, we are talking about white privilege in the classroom, and it is a privilege indeed to introduce to you Professor George Yancey. George Yancey is the professor of philosophy here at Emory University. He works primarily in the areas of critical philosophy of race, critical whiteness studies, and philosophy of the Black experience. He is particularly interested in the formation of African American philosophical thought as articulated within the social and historical space of anti-Black racism, African American agency, and questions of identity formation. His work focuses on the theme of whiteness and how it constitutes a site of embedded social reality and a site of deep and enduring opacity, which is related to what he has theorized as white ambush. Yancey's most recent book is On Race, 34 Conversations in a Time of Crisis, and his forthcoming book is entitled Backlash, What Happens When We Talk Honestly About Racism in America. It's from Rowman and Littlefield. Noam Chomsky says of Backlash, George Yancey's courageous appeal to white America to confront the problems of whiteness, to cultivate a critical awareness of the specter of whiteness and white privilege that each one of you inherits, elicited a remarkable range of responses, some hideous beyond words, some welcoming what he rightly called a gift. This eloquent meditation on the events and their meaning calls on us with piercing honesty to think hard and work hard to excise the malignancy of white supremacy from our culture and our lives. Yancey is also interested in ways to engage philosophy dynamically, to practice frank speech or courageous speech within and outside the classroom. Yancey's publications are varied and extensive. He has authored, edited, and co-edited numerous books, articles, and chapters. His work has been quoted worldwide, including in Turkey, Australia, South Africa, and Sweden. He is known for his powerful and influential conversations with philosophers on race at the Stone New York Times. Yancey is also Philosophy of Race book series editor at Lexington Books. Please join me this afternoon in welcoming Professor and Dr. George Yancey.
Thank you. So I'm on? You can hear me? Okay. I was told I should introduce myself, but I tried practicing that last night and it just didn't sound right. So I appreciate that introduction. Okay, thanks for having me back. Just for those who may have been here last time, it's not as if, during that period I've sort of created this new paradigm shift in terms of how I think about teaching whiteness or race in the classroom. But there are some new, I think, higher stakes here, and I'll raise them. Unlike before, I'm a bit more pessimistic since the last time that I spoke, and I realize that there's some folk who may have voted for Trump here, so I'm trying to respect them at the same time. So Trump was not president at that time. The last time I spoke here, I obviously talked about white privilege, but since Trump's presidency, I fear that I might prove to be far more, or rather it might prove to be far more difficult to talk about white privilege in the classroom. And I say this for two reasons. First, for fear of the sort of growing Orwellian nightmare that kills critical thought. I fear that for the ways in which this ethos might metastasize and further render problematic the invidious nature of policing thought. And then, and not sure if I mentioned this before, that I was on the professor watch list. Maybe many of you all know that. You've heard of that list. I was the only Emory professor there, so I'm not sure what that means. You guys should join me. Second, because Trump's appalling moral equivocation regarding what happened in Charlottesville, and also what I see as his own white racist nativism, I fear for the deepening of what I'm calling a problematic binary between those whites who protested, let's say, at Charlottesville, and those who were the self-identified white racist nationalists. I fear that binary will give, even if only unconsciously, everyday white people a way out. to say something like, you see, I'm not like them, the real white racists, right? So I want to allow those two apparent binaries to bleed into each other as I'm giving this presentation. So having said that, I have to say that this time around, I'm raising the stakes on my presentation, if that's possible, through the following. So Peggy McIntosh, I'm sure many of you have read Peggy McIntosh, but she wrote this famous piece in Critical Whiteness Studies known as The Knapsack. But my reading of her, I read her more radically than she reads herself, although I also know her. But she says, quote, "My schooling gave me no training in seeing myself as an oppressor, as unfairly advantaged person, or as participating in a damaged culture. I was taught to see myself as an individual whose moral state depended on her individual moral will," end quote. She also says that she, quote, "was taught to recognize racism only in individual acts of meanness by members of my group, never in invisible systems conferring unsought racial dominance on my group from birth," end quote. So for me, if you're a white teacher or white professor, and there are a few here, right, then your moral will, I'm arguing, this is me reading Peggy McIntosh more radically, I think, or saying something more explicit. Your moral will is already an issue when you step into the classroom. Also, if white racism is in fact systemic, how can you walk into the classroom and not walk in that classroom being racist? So this discussion, if we are to have it, goes beyond engaging white privilege in the classroom. It is also about the fact that if you are white, you must engage your whiteness in the classroom. And then I have here your racism, question marks, just to give you a little reprieve, right? So I'm arguing in my new work. I argue for what's called, it's fancy, but it's called an ontology and an ethics of no edges. So the idea is that somehow we're always touching each other. We just don't realize. I can say more during the Q&A. And by the way, if I go over time, because we do need to do the Q&A, somebody just let me know, whatever that time is. So that is how I'm raising the stakes. Education has to be dangerous. One has to trouble the taken for granted, the unspoken. And I also want you to know that teaching white privilege in the classroom is one thing. There is so much more out there within larger public spaces, and we shouldn't think that this is such a clean break, again, between the public and the classroom. But I also want you to know that talking about race and racism and white supremacy is dangerous. It's existentially dangerous for some of us. So I want to add this. Out of 100, and this is going to be in the book Backlash, and I'm not trying to promote the book there, but all of these will be, much more will be. So out of hundreds of hateful comments that I received after writing Dear White America, which was in 2015, and again, many of which will be in Backlash, I'm just reading just a few of them to you, just about 4 of them. So, voicemail, quote, "Dear nigger professor, you are a fucking racist. You are a piece of shit destroying the youth of this country. You are neither African nor American. You are pure 100% nigger. You should never marry outside your nigger race. That's a fact. You're a fucking smug nigger. You are uneducated with education. You are a fucking animal, just like all black people in the United States of America, including that nigger Kenyan that was born in fucking Kenya that has usurped the White House. Yes, it is called the White House for a reason, because white people made this country great, you fucking nigger," end quote. Quote, "I read your rant regarding white people, and I am proud to inform you that I will never feel any guilt or shame for being white or who I am. Fuck you, you race-baiting piece of shit. You're just another nigga with a chip on his shoulder that's looking for excuses to justify his hatred. And guess what, asshole? Nobody white gives a fuck what you think. My only regret is that I didn't hear your bullshit in person so that I could call you a fucking nigger to your face, you worthless bitch, and then kick your black ass until you were half dead. Fuck off, boy," end quote. All your studies have forced me to examine myself, image, and my white racist mind. You clearly state that no matter what I think, I am a racist. Okay, cool. Thank you for clearing that up. Now I am forced to say, because you tell me I can say nothing else, Fuck you, nigger. As always, the white guy. This ugly fucking nigger, and it's always here that I go, ugly? Did this guy really check me out? Anyway, it's a little humor in the midst of so much horror and terror and hatred. This ugly fucking nigger is just asking for access to more white females. In a sane world, this ugly nigger would be just beheaded ISIS style. Make America great again. And there was another one that said that, and for those who know, parrhesia or fearless speech is important to me. I'm going to say something about that in a minute. One guy wrote and said that Dr. Yancey wrote this letter in order to get white women to suck his dick. One guy wrote the following: nigger, 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 nigger. That was the response to Dear White America, which was, I called it, a gift to white people. And I wanted them to act out of a space of love, James Baldwin's sense of love, or Bell Hook's sense of love, not Hollywood nonsense, right? Okay, so here we go. So I just gave you that as a framework, just to think about the gravity of this problem. So I'll share some of my concerns that arise within, this is kind of some of the old stuff, but some new, within the classroom where critical philosophy of race is taught at predominantly white universities and where the classes are predominantly white. As before, many points here are fragments, partly because there's a limit in terms of the amount of stuff that I can cover, and because I don't think there's a quick algorithm for solving the problems that come up in predominantly white classrooms regarding race or white privilege. So hopefully these fragments will open up a discussion in a productive way. So keep in mind that my field, philosophy, is still very white and very male. So in terms of African Americans, we make up about 1.1%. Well, in terms of black bodies, 1.1%. But if you break that up in terms of those from the Caribbean, Africa, and here in North America, let's say, we're even smaller within that group. There might be 30, 40 African American women who have PhDs in the field of philosophy. Also, so it's the whitest of the humanities, I think, unless you guys have something to trump that, but I think it's philosophy. Also, keep in mind that philosophy has only recently given serious attention to race as a philosophical issue. So I'm invested in this project of teaching whiteness in the classroom, to say nothing of whiteness that presumes to be non-raced. So I personally face particular challenges when teaching race and whiteness within the classroom or within the canon of philosophy itself, especially as when you're reading certain philosophers, you knew that those philosophers knew or thought that you couldn't read their stuff. So if you're reading Immanuel Kant and you knew that Kant thought that if you were black from head to toe, clearly whatever you say is stupid, how do you read Kant? Or Hegel, who says there's no Geist in sub-Saharan Africa. But anyway, because bodies of color in academia walk into classrooms, the problem is that our bodies are already a priori, as it were, a priori, always already marked, where white racist normative assumptions truncate who we are and what we are deemed capable or incapable of teaching. So I'm arguing there's an epistemological truncation in terms of what we know or don't know, but there's also an ontological truncation, a truncation of our very being and the meaning of our being. It was nice and yet strange back at Duquesne when one black female student said to me one day, and this speaks to white privilege and how it operates. She said, publicly how she was proud to have me as a teacher because I was a black philosopher, she said. And I took that, it was like a very nice compliment. And the white students they felt a bit strange by this, like, what do we make of this? Yet imagine that being said of a white philosopher. Imagine a white student raising her hand and saying something like, it's great to be taught by a white professor or a white philosopher. I mean, it would be something bordering on racism. It's structurally, in some sense, or discursively, a white student couldn't say that. Right? We can open that up if you like. Okay, here's my fundamental framework. To think about whiteness as what I call the transcendental norm. That norm operates in your classrooms, and that norm operates at Emory, and that norm operates in this space right now. In all of the courses that I teach on race, we cover the concept of whiteness as a transcendental norm, which means that non-whites are deemed different, deviant, raced, marked, named. White people then are the unraced, the unmarked, the not named. In other words, you're considered persons as persons, or just simply humans qua humans, or humans as humans. And they're also built in within this notion of whiteness as the transcendental norm, the notion of negation and hierarchy. So within the notion of whiteness as a transcendental norm is a binary. In fact, I argue that whiteness is structurally binary. It needs the other in order to define itself. And it also has a hierarchy. In other words, then, the notion of, think about whiteness, again, now I'm repeating my thing, as structurally binary. And if you want an example of this, think about BET, right, of whiteness as a transcendental norm. What is BET? Black entertainment. But what is wet? Yeah, it's water. Yeah. And it's all over the place, and it finds its way in all these crevices, right? So WET is white entertainment television. It's all the other stuff, right? So in my classrooms, there is the necessity to talk about white privilege, which is linked to whiteness as the transcendental norm. So within that context, we talk about privilege as a site of immunity. So whites are immune to certain things in virtue of being white, which raises the issue then of complicity, which you see as a deeper issue than just pedagogical here. There's something deeply politically and ontologically and ethically at stake here. When teaching courses that explore race and whiteness, I think that for whites, and this includes white teachers as well as white students, white professors, they must nurture the following dispositions. And I'm calling them dispositions because one is always striving, right? So they're dispositions even as you will fail as you do them. So one, a willingness, and this feels a little repetitive to me because I've thought about it for so long, but it'll be new to you, I hope. A willingness to speak parrhesia is that Greek word that means fearless or courageous speech. It also means to say it all. If you guys know Michel Foucault, he talks about this. The one who speaks parrhesia is the Parrhesiastes. Martin Luther King, Audre Lorde, Socrates, you pick your figure, right? But it's parrhesia, this desire and this aim to speak fearlessly, or courageously is a better word. Two, to listen courageously or fearlessly, which is the capacity to be vulnerable. And if you look at the etymology, and I love etymologies, if you look at the etymology of vulnerable, it means to be wounded. So what does it mean to teach a course, whatever your course happens to be, and when you're examining whiteness and white privilege, what does it mean for you to be pedagogically wounded, right? To be vulnerable. What does that look like in the classroom? And I'm also now calling this white crisis, or being, another nice term that I use is unsutured, and I'm prepared to define those with great clarity. Unsutured or be in crisis. What does it mean to be white and to teach a course where you recognize white privilege and for your whiteness to be in crisis? In fact, what does whiteness in crisis look like? Right. Three, an awareness, to the extent that this is possible, of one's whiteness as a site of embedded privilege and what I call psychic opacity, which is my claim that, one, you can't step outside white supremacy. It's not as if white supremacy is here and you can kind of go like that and then you see it's there. No, it's still here. And also the opacity notion claims that if you are white, you can't know the limits of your own racism, is my claim. You can't know the limits. So if you're a white professor or teacher, what does that mean then at a place like Emory? If you go into the classroom, always already embedded in structures of white privilege and white supremacy, and at the same time, you can't know the limits of your own racism. What does that mean? What are the pedagogical implications? Four, an awareness that one's whiteness is, and I'm sort of repeating this again, is an embedded reality. Embodied, that's different, an embodied reality. And that as such, one's whiteness signifies meanings over and above what one intends. So the ways in which one's whiteness has a meaning over something like good intentions. Five, an awareness of one's positionality as white and how this mediates hidden epistemological assumptions and axiological assumptions. Axiology, just a big word, comes from axia, that means value. So your value assumptions. For an example, what we, in other words, as whites, I'm saying we, but as whites, what we value, what you value, and how this mediates what should be known or what is relevant epistemologically. So the epistemological also assumes what whites assume to be true of all knowers, which is a problem, right? And if you're interested, I would suggest that you read philosopher Charles Mills' essay called Non-Cartesian Sums. It's a very important piece because he takes up this practical problem of what was it like for him to teach a course on African American philosophy and not finding the literature out there, right? And so he ended up writing this piece called Non-Cartesian Sums. And what he found is that when he wanted to think about the ways in which black people undergo certain kinds of experiences, which we might call Erlebnis, or lived experience in the world, they encountered modernity, the Enlightenment, a world that just didn't relegate their bodies to insignificance, but considered them so insignificant that they weren't even mentioned, right? And so he eventually does this beautiful job and brilliant job of bringing in Ralph Ellison, and he sort of says, look, in fact, he compares Ralph Ellison to Descartes. So if you've ever read Descartes, you know that there's this moment where he wants to doubt the existence, well, he doubts the existence of the whole world. In fact, he doubts his own existence, right? Do I exist? Is this a dream? Then Mills brings this in as a route, Ellison in as a route toward critiquing philosophy in the form of ideal theory, which he sees as a sort of conceptual abstraction of whiteness. In fact, he argues at the end of the day, what do we do when we have a bunch of white guys who are really just jerking off? Conceptually. And if you imagine that, sort of really try to imagine that, it looks really kind of a site of debauchery, right? White guys jerking off. Anyway, so the point is that, look, Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man walks into the world, and as he's in the world, as Fanon might say, he comes live into the world. He wants to walk around with effortless grace, but he can't because white people don't see him. But if you're black, right, African American, if you're in a classroom learning about Descartes, and you're being asked to think about the fact that your body doesn't exist, or the world doesn't exist, the question becomes, how does that do epistemic violence to how you understand your own body? So Mills eventually says, well, learning about Descartes seems to be a site of a kind of social perk of privilege to engage in what seems to be a fairly universal concern, namely, does the world exist? Right? So he says that we can't have epistemic well, actually he doesn't say that, I say that. You can't have kind of epistemic substitutability. You can't take that for granted. Right? Good. But it's also being respectful to students, right? And by the way, you have to be careful with this, it's not just a question of inclusion, because inclusion can happen, I might state this somewhere else. Inclusion can happen within predominantly white spaces, where whiteness continues to be the center. Right? In that case, well, what do you really got then? You're just including people of color. And people of color don't want to be included. We want to trouble the center that includes us. Right? Okay. 6, a willingness to render one's whiteness strange. Name it, nominate it, mark it. If you're interested in the work of Richard Dyer, he talks about this. Right? I suggest often to have white people go home, get naked, alone, and look at your white bodies in the mirror and ask yourselves what's so important about them. And just see what happens. Right? Why are they deemed so beautiful and so intelligent and so civilized? So what are the discourses that are shaping that? Right? And then how do you bring that into the classroom? Because it's there. Right? My claim is that you can't get out of it, so you're bringing it. So how do you mark whiteness as strange within the context of a classroom? And thereby marking whiteness as strange within the context of the classroom. 7, a cognizance of the ways in which one's area of specialization, maybe you all can tell me how this works in your areas, that positions whiteness as the center. For an example, whether it's psychology, sociology, theology, literature, philosophy, you have it. Maybe I didn't name some of the fields. 9, and even as I'm saying cognizance, I believe that there are internal limits to that. 9, a cognizance that unteaching, unlearning, disarticulated modes of racism is not about arrival. So if there's a place called arrival, in terms of being an anti-racist white, I'm saying there is no place called arrival. So give it up. So what does that mean then? It means that every day of your life, you will have to engage, you have to disarticulate the ways in which whiteness privileges you. In the classroom, outside of the classroom, because again, they bleed, right? And also hope. And I'm just throwing this on the side since I'm going. I'm arguing that white people don't need hope. You can challenge me on this, right? What does it mean to bring hope to the classroom, and how is that counterproductive? That's what I'm suggesting. It sounds so counterintuitive, but it's really quite interesting. Right? We need a post-hope. 10, a cognizance of how sympathy for the other, how I'm helping you, right? And self-critique, you see how good I am at doing white privilege work, right? How these can function to reinscribe whiteness as the center. Right? And if you're interested, see Sarah Ahmed's work. 11, a willingness to incorporate literature that is about people of color while engaging the dialectics of race vis-a-vis whiteness. Right? And I'll give an example of how that can go wrong in a minute. 12, getting white students to identify quotidian or ordinary everyday moments in and outside the classroom and how whiteness places genuine diversity under erasure, their friends, who they hang out with, etc., and getting them to do something that counters this. Right? So if one is to take education, which comes from educare, which means to lead out, if you're to take that seriously, then it seems to me you're talking about something like theoria and praxis, right? What do you do outside of the classroom? So what am I trying to do in my classrooms? I'm trying to create dangerous spaces within my classrooms. Dangerous spaces. And what does this mean? What we need are critical dangerous spaces where vulnerability, and so I'm thinking these are dangerous spaces, where vulnerability and anxiety can be nurtured in white students who find themselves faced with critical questions about race that mark their bodies as problem bodies. Now, this may sound highfalutin, right? But it works. It takes a long time. Let me give you some examples of how it works. How do you mark white bodies as problem bodies and get away with that? Right? But not just get away with it, but to identify a sort of history that is accurate, right? Or giving a thick theoretical account that makes sense of that. Creating moments of trauma are important, again, etymologically, which means to wound, within the context of classrooms. How do you create trauma? We need forms of trauma that unsettle various meta-narratives that ground and underwrite white privilege and white so-called superiority. This is necessary for white students in order to begin to disarticulate, again, various mythopoetic constructions of whiteness that have reinforced their naturalized place of dominance in the world. And I am telling you from firsthand experience, white students at Emory have not engaged critically the question of whiteness. And that there are all kinds of hidden assumptions about their identities as being non-raced, as being superior, as being normative. So we need a form of Bildung, or paideia, or education as educare, that actually cultivates vulnerability in white students, a space where they are wounded, undergo moments of trauma and narrative disorientation, cognitive disorientation, and embodied disorientation in terms of their whiteness. I'm just going to pause and just spontaneously give this as an example. So this is what happened recently in my classroom. So this wasn't planned, but after the tragic shooting in Las Vegas, right? I don't know what you guys did after when you came to class. Did you all give a minute in your classroom of silence? Maybe some of you didn't. How many teachers are here, professors? Okay, so majority, I think. So what we did is we gave a minute, right? We could have given more time, but a minute in silence. There we were. Right, respecting, the lives of these people. And because of the kind of parrhesiastic space that I've now created, one black male student, I'm not going to identify his name, it's not important, in fact, which I shouldn't. Before I get there, one white student, a female student in the back, started to cry. Fair enough, right? Because she said she had a friend who had a friend who died. So she had a friend who had a friend who died. And so she started to cry, and she said, and it was very visceral, right? Palpable. She said, I just don't know what to do. I just don't know what to do. And there was this silence in the room. So the one African-American male spoke up, and he said, look, I understand what you're saying. And you might think it's not sympathetic, but it's incredible at this moment. He says, I understand, but look, we feel this way all the time, referring to black people. It's as if we have undergone that massacre every day of our lives. So it was this incredible moment, right, to shift the focus. And I then had to, as the professor, say, look, And I said very clearly, don't leave here and go back and tell people that somehow the black students in this room shifted, a sort of natural empathy, and not more than empathy, and concern for what happened in Las Vegas, and now made it into a race issue, right? But then the black student said, but it's already a race issue. The kind of attention that's given to the death of those individuals, which must all say, bottom line, is tragic, right? Unconscionable. But notice how race and race privilege operates in that space. So our question then becomes here that we can discuss, to what extent does the white student who cried, not that her tears were inauthentic, but how does she cry for those predominantly white bodies versus a Tamir Rice, or Trayvon Martin, or Eric Gardner, or Sandra Bland? Right? That's the question I'm asking. But it was a creative moment to talk about white privilege right there, without, by the way, emptying out the existential gravitas of what happened in Las Vegas. Okay. So we need this narrative disorientation, cognitive disorientation, and embodied disorientation. That's what happened in that classroom. There was a disorientation in terms of whiteness. So within a larger framework, we need to create spaces that will encourage crisis, where white students get to face their finitude, their white relative emptiness, which is something I'm willing to talk about, and all of the lies that they have been told up until this point, because I'm arguing that they've been lied to. So a lot of work has to be done. To tarry within this space is about being reborn, and I don't mean this theologically, but is there anybody in the theology department here? Well, one. So there's some theological resonance here, right? Which is always painful, always a painful process. Yet, of course, for me, it's always rebirth over and over and over again. One never stops being reborn. Yet, it is about realizing that this rebirth, there I am, is always a penultimate process. Given that our white students have lived with a multitude of lies about their natural superiority and entitlement, and has not had their whiteness named and pointed out, and by the way, this need not be said to them explicitly, but communicated to them implicitly through silence in terms of their status in the world. They will need to grieve. So the question becomes, what does grieving look like over whiteness once one finds out that whiteness ain't all that to begin with, right? Sorry to tell you, but it ain't all that. In fact, why should we want to be white? If white people are the exemplars of what it means to be ethical, then what we've seen, why do we want that? That's me improvising again. Think here of the concept of metanoia, which I'm using as a kind of breakdown, which needn't necessarily be thwarted. So metanoia in the classroom. And it's here that white people who have come to embrace, I think, the importance of white crisis and the value of losing their way, will need to benefit again from a container, I'm talking about grieving again, or a community whereby they are able to express crisis and uncertainty as they strive to struggle with transformation and grieve that process of loss. So 3 pedagogical experiences. I'm coming to an end. 3 pedagogical experiences. This is one example that I said I would come back to, a promissory note. So this is one grad course that I took way back at Duquesne. So this is something that happened. So we're taking a course in African American literature. What occurred to me immediately is that the white students in the classroom took African American literature as marked, right? So it became a site of the exotic. It was the different stuff. It wasn't literature as such. It was African American literature, black literature, right? So we're reading, I remember one of the thin version of, Frederick Douglass wrote 3 of them, but the thin one, the autobiography of Frederick Douglass. And I remember asking the classroom, all white, by the way, that how does it make you feel? For example, during that fight with Covey and Douglass, I could identify with Douglass, right? So there was a kind of a historical longevity in terms of what Douglass was doing vis-a-vis Covey and my own experience as a black man. I could identify with him. So I asked the class, fellow students, how do you all feel? How do you identify with Mr. Auld the guy who said you can't teach a nigger how to read in the text, or Covey. And what they said to me was interesting. They said, George, we haven't thought about that. So here's a case where they failed to identify, and the professor failed at this, although she came out later and sort of gave this wonderful qualification, failed to identify the ways in which there is continuity between that text and the way in which whiteness has not gone away, and the way in which black bodies and bodies of color continue to suffer, right? So I would like to think that what I did at that moment was to create that space called the dangerous, right? In other words, I created a pedagogical space within which safety did not function to obfuscate the realities of racism. So the more we play it safe, what happens, even if inadvertently, white people get to live their lives and move in the world with effortless grace. And we don't want them to do that, quite frankly. So this is a case where the classroom had not been dangerous. It was safe for white people, safe for them not to see the connection between themselves and past forms of whiteness and white supremacy. They were free to see African American literature as being something, call it exotic, something that was other to them, not them. But it didn't, as Judith Butler might say, speak to them from elsewhere. They didn't hear the voice. Another example, my Race Matters course. And this was a course that I had taught, and I still teach it here as a great course, and something happened. But once a space had been opened, so I want to sort of demonstrate, this is what happens when a space is open, this kind of dangerous space, this unsuturing happens, this kind of metanoia happens, this is what happens. So this was a case where, let me see. So this is a space where I opened that kind of woundedness, this being unsutured. So it was a space where a white student opened up to us and said, look, I was walking one day and I'm going to use this word, apologize for it, but I'm saying this verbatim. He said that a lot of black guys called me a faggot. Now, he had identified as gay. And so I ask you for forgiveness for using that term, but they called him a faggot. But what he said to us in the classroom, well, he said, but I thought to myself, I might be a faggot, but at least I ain't black. Right? So it's an incredible moment where to be black is ersatz to being the F word. Right? I can be that, but at least I'm not black. Which, of course, for me confirms my view about the structural binary nature of whiteness, how blackness is this on this end, all the way on the end. It constitutes this racial Manichaean divide. But again, I'm saying that to say this is what happened. That would not have happened had I not created this kind of foundation for this kind of vulnerability. There was another experience, some of you all may remember this when I said it last time, of a white student who shared that she was walking with her boyfriend, a white boyfriend, and he saw a black female in front of them. And he said, and turned to his white girlfriend and said, "Why don't you have an ass like that?" Right? And she turned to him, her white boyfriend, and said, "At least I've got real hair." Right? So here's a case where she was complicit as a white woman in objectifying the black female body, hence complicit with her boyfriend, and a certain kind of racialized or sexualized racialized patriarchy. But she was also complicit with white aesthetics, right? So why this example? It's not to tantalize, right? It's to say, look, something's happening in these classrooms, right? The space that I've created. How long have they held on to that, right? And Joe Fagan has this exercise that I've also used where he calls it backstage racism, where you get your students to keep a list, a log, a journal of all of the experiences of white racism that they experience. Of course, they have to be able to identify them, right? Bless you. And they bring them in. I wish I had some of those to read, but they're incredible. So these are white students who hung out with other whites. And when they started taking notes, like one white girl said to her friend that, I don't date black guys. She's like, well, why don't you date black guys? And she says, well, you ever see their hands? She says, what are you talking about? Well, when they turn them over, they look like gorilla hands, right? Or a white guy who said, again, this is notation, who said, I'm a boxer. And he was a boxer. He was like kind of doing some boxing, I guess. And he said, look, and he admitted to the student, when I want to get really angry, like to go all out in boxing, I imagine my white girlfriend being banged by some really big black guy. Imagine, right? And this is contemporary stuff. Sorry, I was going to use another word. This is contemporary stuff, right? So what's going on there, right? Dare I say it? Fear of the big black dick? I mean, come on, are you kidding me? Anyway, another race matters example. So we were talking about bell hooks, and bell hooks talks about terror. Whiteness is terror, right? Which is so profound because America likes to think that it only experienced terror on 9/11. We might say, yes, sure, fair enough, right? But black bodies have experienced terror long before that. It was called white supremacy, right? And so I posed the question to the students, have you ever felt terror, right, in the form of whiteness? Now, given that Duquesne is disproportionately white, well, predominantly white, one black student says, she raised her hand and says, yes, I know exactly what that's like. And she says, I was in a classroom where it was all white in high school, and I was known as the black girl. And I didn't like the way that felt. That felt like it was stinging the very epidermis of my body, right? I was always called out as the white girl. As the black girl. Then what happened was a white girl student raised her hand with a lot of enthusiasm. I said, yeah, go ahead. And she says, I know exactly what that's like. I was at a predominantly black school, and I was called the white girl. So again, here's a wonderful moment, right? Something's going wrong here. We want to say, wow, kind of sorry to hear that, right? But then we want to step back and say, excuse me, welcome to the club. But not just welcome to the club. One, she didn't listen to the black female student, right? But shifted the conversation to her white experience. So here are the subtle ways in which white privilege operates. She reinscribed whiteness, thus valorizing her own white experience. Two, she attempted to conflate the historical experiences and practices around naming, right? I mean, you can be called the black girl and protest that, and God knows what could happen to you, right? It's just like being called a nigger and then standing up and saying, can I say fuck you right now? Okay, and like saying fuck you and then having your life taken versus saying you hunky or you cracker, right? It doesn't have the same valence. It doesn't have the same historical weight. It's my contention that there's no racial epithet that we could use that is comparable to the word nigger, right? So there's a way in which there's this weird kind of conflation that was going on. And then lastly, she placed the one black girl's experience under erasure, right? She placed it under erasure. She wiped it out, right? It became a question of white fear, white sorrow, right? And then there is all the stuff, and I'm coming to an end now, and then there's all the stuff that's said and implied that comes up in classrooms where there are predominantly white students. Stuff like the following. Why don't we have a white student union? Right? Two, why don't we have White History Month? Why can't I use the term nigger? And this really happened, by the way. One white student said it's discriminatory to say that we cannot use the term nigger. And then another student backed him up, white student. That's right! As if like to get something going, like, yeah, that's right, let's use the term nigger. But if you read Shannon Sullivan's work, she does some important work. She calls this a site, Shannon Sullivan, of ontological expansiveness. That whiteness wants to inhabit all spaces. It wants everything. And if you think about the way in which I've thought about whiteness as a site of emptiness, that means that whiteness has to keep eating. It has to keep consuming. And it wants to consume those bodies of color. My question is, what happens when it has no more to eat? I'm just putting it out there metaphorically, right? And Du Bois has this quote, I don't know it verbatim, but he says something like, what is whiteness but the ownership of the earth forever, 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 amen. I'm sure that's not verbatim, but it's something like that, right? So just imagine how white privilege operates. We have to be able to use the term nigger as well. if we whites can't use the N-word, then this is me again, this is discrimination. Or I don't see race, I just see people. Or, and I'm going to just say this, and I'm not being anti-Semitic here, I have to say that. Why, I have no idea, but I have to. There was a Jewish student in one of my classes, and she said, we were talking about the ways in which black bodies are profiled by police. And she said that as Jewish, she can also be profiled. And it was like, well, can you tell me what you mean by that? Because for all intents and purposes, you look white. And if you guys know the history of that, Jews have become white. She said, well, if a white police officer should pull me over, it's when I show him my license that he will then read my last name and say, it's Jewish. But do you see what's happening here? I mean, what does that mean, right? I mean, this is the kind of lack of criticality that's coming out of our classrooms, right? Now, I had to say to her, look, I'm on your side. I'm against anti-Semitism, but you can't conflate these experiences. It's not about, being stopped as a black person and then the police officer sees a license and goes, oh, yeah, so it's true that you are black. No, it doesn't work like that. There's no last name, And then another Jewish student said, well, I experience anti-Semitism as well when I wear my yarmulke. But I don't have to wear anything or take off anything, damn it. It's in virtue of being black, vis-a-vis whiteness. Nothing else. No modification is necessary, right? So there's a problem there, what we need to talk about. Adorno says, and Charles Mills gets him on this, that there is something, I can't get it verbatim, but there is no poetry after Auschwitz. And Mills says, well, then there must not have been poetry prior to that. Because, there was the the transatlantic slave trade experience. There was what happened in Asia, South America. What about poetry then? Anyway, I'm all for a colorblind society. Why do we have to make these racial distinctions? And there are whites who, by the way, quote Martin Luther King and say he wanted a world in which his children would grow up and would be judged on the content of their character, not just. So any talk of race then, when Yancey talks of race, he's violating King's ethics. Talking about whiteness the way that you do is a form of racist generalization. In fact, you, Dr. Yancey, you are the racist. In fact, if you would stop talking about race, Yancey, racism would go away. And if you're a woman, just know how easy that is. Let me tell you as a man, if you all just stop talking about sexism, I assure you it will go away. It's the magic of words. Just stop talking about it. How does that make you feel, right? 8, of course race is real. Why do you think blacks are so good at basketball? This is a discussion within the context of whether race is real or social construction. One student, of course it's real. Are you kidding me? Have you seen those guys dunk? 9, I've never lynched a black person. We didn't own slaves. 10, look, I'm just an individual. I don't see myself as white. Just call me Grace. 11, why don't we just stop talking about race? Again, a little redundancy. 12, we've talked about whiteness enough. I get it. So I had a white student once. This is a whole semester of basically talking about whiteness. And like 2 weeks in, he's like, I got this thing, right? Can we move on? As if it was like a Rubik's Cube problem, right? Or some math or something like, I got that algebraic equation thing. I can do it now. No, you can't. Damn it. I mean, all your life you have not thought about whiteness, and 2 weeks in, you've got it? Anyway, you continue, 13, you continue to talk about race, and that's why it continues to see some of these are redundant, but 14, my dad told me that you want me to feel guilty about my whiteness. So this is a white student who went home, and his dad, rightly so, would ask him, so what are you studying? I'm taking this course with Dr. Yancey, and we're talking about whiteness. Be careful. He'll have you thinking that you ought to be guilty for being white. So be careful. And what was nice about that, the fact that he shared this, is that he could have held that through his own dad's protection of whiteness and allegedly pedagogical instructions or whatever, protecting his son. His son could have internalized that in this closed down, sutured, what I'm saying, sutured in the classroom. 15, And I just have 22 and we're done. When I think about whites with guns, it seems unnatural to me, but blacks with guns seem natural. This is a comment that came out by a student when there was that killing, the shooting at Duquesne. So that when whites have guns, it's unnatural, but when black people have guns, it's natural. Somebody's missing some serious history there. 16, I'm afraid of all men regardless of race. So this is a case where we talk about the way in which women respond to race, racialized black men. And then you'll hear a white student, typically a white female student, will say, no, it's not about race, Dr. Yancey. I'm just afraid of men. But perception is not that pure, right? It's intersectional. It's compounded. You can't just see man qua man. What is that? What is man as such, right? Beyond all of those other modifiers. I feel picked on as a white person in this classroom. And I'll say to that, fair enough. But it's the wrong direction, right? But at least they're saying that, right? 18, blacks have all the privileges through affirmative action. What are you guys talking about? Whites, you guys have got everything. I'm being left out. 19, my father worked his ass off to get where he is. This was not about white privilege. He worked 3 jobs. I'll just leave that one out there. 20, when I was in high school, some black students had cars. How can I be said to have privilege if this is true? How can I be said to have privilege if this is true? After all, I didn't have a car. So these are very, very concrete, everyday, but very significant epistemological issues in terms of white privilege. 21, if racism is systemic, why then should I try not to be racist? So I've had white students say to me, Dr. Yancey, you've given us this position. How can I get out of it? In fact, you know what? Your position leads me to one conclusion. I'm going to go out and be the best racist that I can be. I've had students say that to me. So that's the message that they got. 22. This was from a student who wrote a paper for me, and it was not a joke. It was a paper on looking at race. It's a white female, and she wrote, quote, I think that white men are discriminated against because black men have larger penises. That's what she wrote. And the peculiar thing is that, I guess had she put a smiley face next to it, that would have just been bad. Because that would have just thrown me completely off. Like, what the hell does that mean? Or smile or something as a joke, but it wasn't a joke. She meant it, right? But what is that to say? That's to say that we have failed our students. We've failed our white students. Well, we've failed more than our white students, but we're talking about white privilege here, right? And then finally, one of my favorite, which was told to me by a white male student, not here, by the way, at Emory, you know that Dr. Yancey hates white people, don't you? And then my favorite response, some of my best friends are white. Thank you.